You're listening to Beyond the Stage from the Carpenter Performing Arts Center at Cal State Long Beach. In each episode, we introduce you to the artists, scholars, students, and arts professionals interpreting our world through the arts. Join us this week and every week this summer as we explore their stories. Let's get started. Okay, hello everyone, and today I am here with Seung-hoon Jeong, an assistant professor in the Film and Electronic Arts Department, focused in critical studies and international cinema at California State University, Long Beach. He is a professor and a film critic from South Korea, and he joined CSULB after working as an assistant professor at New York University, Abu Dhabi, and has held visiting professorships at Columbia University and several Korean universities. He has worked on film theory and critical issues through diverse films and focuses on global cinema related to multiculturalism, abjection, catastrophe, and networking with biopolitical, ethical, and psychoanalytic philosophies. Jeong has received Korea's Cine 21 Film Criticism Award in 2003 and the Society for Cinema and Media Studies Dissertation Award in 2012, and is writing Global Cinema, a Biopolitical and Ethical Reframing, due out sometime in 2021. I'd like to welcome Professor Jeong here with us today. Welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I am happy to be with you. This is a new kind of adventure, which I should be able to enjoy.
Thank you. Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. So first I want to start, how are you today? Are you doing well? And you're here, you've made it here to the States with us. You're a new professor at CSULB. You just joined us this semester. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. So today I'm very fine. I think I'm a little affected by the weather. And today is very sunny, and I'm always happy under the California sun. And I've been here for 3 months. I came here in January. So far, everything's online. But then I'm very glad to meet everybody who's so nice and friendly online. So I really look forward to meeting them in person in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think we're all looking forward to finally being together in person soon, hopefully. So I wanted to start with a little bit about your background. Can you tell us how you got started in film and studying film and film criticism?
Yes, there may be a long story, but then briefly, I think that in my childhood, I became a kind of cinephile, though I didn't have any idea about that kind of thing. I just liked, to watch films on TV, especially because when I was young, the theater was not always available. But whenever there was a chance, I went there. Even by myself and so on and so forth. But then TV was, at that point, it was almost like the only cultural platform for me to explore the outside of my small family, and neighborhood and nation and so on and so forth. So what I got from a lot of films that I've seen, for example, even on the channel called AFKN, which is American Forces Korean Network. Yes. So that was for the U.S. military people based in Korea. But then that was available on TV too. So whenever I was tired of studying and whatever, I just went out to the living room, even in the dark when my parents were sleeping, turn on the TV, and then sometimes AFK showed a lot of movies, mostly American, but then other international too. And of course, at the time, I didn't know the way films is made or what was the role of the director or whatever. But then a few films I still remember. I have seen then. I saw around that time still linger in my mind. For example, there was a film called Breathless. And then actually the original title was Abu Souffle. That was a French film. It was a very famous one made by Jean-Luc Godard. It's one of the most important filmmakers in 1960. But then it was remade in Hollywood in around the 1980s. And then the Hollywood version is, as you may guess, it's much more secular and then much more conventional. But at the same time, it starred Richard Gere, who was a kind of a rising star at the moment. And then this is a film about a couple who are in a kind of romantic elopement. They fall in love with each other, but then they are in some sense outlaws, though, so that they are pursued by the police. And They have to, go away from the society. And at a certain point, there's a kind of deadlock. And then the main character, played by Richard Gere, in this Hollywood version of Breathless, surrounded by the police, and then he is now kind of about to be arrested. And then at the moment, the ending shows his sudden kind of dance movement, just in the middle of the street. People, all the police are surrounding you, and then you are just in the middle of the ground there. And then he, started to dance very briefly. It's very sudden, but then it was so impressive to me. I don't know why, but it just captured me. And his buttocks were so sexy, so that I think that in the end, Richard Gere's buttocks drew me to film.
I love it. I haven't seen that film, but now I want to watch it.
I recommend it. It's available on YouTube too.
It's funny. So my dad was actually in the military, so I grew up on AFN.
Oh, you know that? Okay.
Yes, yeah. Well, my dad was stationed in Europe, so I grew up on the European version of Armed Forces Network. But yes, and it's funny because they don't play commercials, so it's just kind of like infomercials. And those I really remember for some reason. So
exactly, yeah. That was quite useful. I mean, retroactively kind of remembering that it was a channel that in some sense kind of, collects a series of the most interesting American TV dramas and shows and films, right? So,
yes. Kind of a wide variety of things.
Exactly. It's the total, present gift package.
Yeah. So then after, you developed this love of cinema as a child, as a kid, then what made you want to study it in school and then go on to be a professor and a critic?
Yes. So actually, even though I liked films, just like an amateur fan, I got into literature a lot. And actually, I studied, French literature in my college for my MA, BA, and even MA. And I even got into the PhD program for the same department of French literature. And I was very much interested in French literary theory and criticism rather than just poems or novels. That was related to my original, inclination and then great interest in philosophy. Yeah. Anyway, there was a lot of overlap between literary criticism and theory and the philosophy. So that was my realm. But at the same time, I always, enjoyed films and sometimes wanted to write about them and so on and so forth. And then there were like a kind of online platforms emerging at the period when I got into writing about the literature and then film. So I wrote, some film reviews and book reviews and something like that. And in the end, I had a chance to receive an award from a film criticism award in Korea. And then it, in some sense, gave me the chance to become a film critic. So I worked as film critic for 1 year or so for that magazine that initiated that award ceremony. And it was very exciting. But at the same time, quite exhausting too, because I had to watch new films that were released just last weekend, and I have to write something about that this Monday, and then it's published next Monday, and something like that. So the cycling was very, very short. While I was still in my school for my PhD program, so at a certain point, I had to make a decision between going back to school or going further in this film journalism as like a film critic. But then this latter choice was not kind of feasible in many aspects because, the market was still small, and then, it's quite fluctuating, and there's no kind of real job security or whatever, as you may guess, okay? Well, and then I thought that I would need more kind of substantial, training in terms of film criticism and knowledge, because that was not my major in my universities. So I end up deciding to study cinema more systematically. That's why I, came to the study for my PhD. So in the United States, I did my PhD in both film studies and comparative literature because I had a big literary background. But in the end, the film was my choice. So I'm now a film scholar.
Yeah. How would you say that the study of literature and comparative literature and French philosophy really has played a role in like the way you critique film, or does it play a role? I said earlier that, when I was reading your bio that you study, or you look at film theory and criticism through multiculturalism, objection, networking with biopolitical, ethical, and psychoanalytic philosophies. I feel like you're taking kind of what you've done over here with French philosophy and studying literature and applied it to like a film criticism lens. How do those play a role together?
Definitely, as you just listed a few things that I put in my bio, actually. Yes, all these came from my literary and theoretical background, which is much larger than film studies itself. And then historically, film studies is kind of a new discipline. It emerged in the 1960s and 70s. The U.S. universities started to have film studies as a kind of a department and discipline around that time. And before that, there was nothing like that. Of course, the film has only 1 century history, right? So the beginning of film study itself completely depended on disciplines from other fields, especially literature has a long history and its studies has a lot of things, to develop. And then, so in that sense, the shift from literature to cinema for me was very kind of natural. It was not like a big drastic shift. Okay. And then especially theoretically, for example, the concept of abjection you mentioned is a psychoanalytic concept developed by Julia Kristeva, who is a French philosopher and psychoanalyst and literary critic too. And then in the 1980s, she wrote a wonderful book about that concept. And then it became a kind of catchword in the arena of humanities and art in general. So a lot of art criticism uses this term, as well as some film scholars too. And I wanted to reframe the concept in my own approach to global cinema. And that kind of thing always happens in my study of film. Okay. So very briefly, if you are interested, the concept of abjection is to cast out something that is part of you, but then that is no longer useful or even that is harmful for you. So you need to cut it off from you, okay? And this process itself is called abjection. It means, you just abandon something that was, inside you, but then this is no longer part of you in some sense, okay? But then that does not disappear completely. It always comes back, which is called the abject, okay? So the encounter with the abject can be, in some sense, detected in so many films. Something that was, in some sense, kind of, excluded from my family, my identity, my community, even my nation, comes back in the form of, for example, terrorists or refugees or something like that. So this is like a global social context in which what I call the social abject comes back to us and then asks important questions to think about in terms of globalization and my relationship with those people and so on. So it started with a very psychoanalytic and theoretical kind of approach to certain issues, but then I think that it can be applicable to this larger social context, which is well addressed by so many films. Yes.
Yeah, I have to admit, I was reading some of your scholarly work and some of your criticisms, and when I first read, I was like, abjection and biopolitical film. I was like, I don't think I've seen any of these films. But then you made a comparison to Skyfall, one of the James Bond films, and how that was a form of abjection. Can you talk a little bit about how these show up in our in quote unquote popular cinema, and that they really do relate to films that many people have seen, but we maybe don't identify the philosophies or psychologies that are happening within those films?
Exactly. I mean, you explored a lot about me.
I tried to do my homework.
Oh, that's great. Wonderful. It's a good research. Well, yes, Skyfall, as you may have seen it, it's like a James Bond film, right? It's one of the most kind of luxurious, entertaining franchises in the film history. So maybe, a lot of people would just enjoy it and forget it when they just leave the theater, right? But then, one reason for that franchise to last so for long means that it always updates itself in a way of responding to the changing socio-political environments. Okay, and then what is the role of the 007, which is secret agent? In some sense, this is very interesting figure. Any country has such a figure, right? Who works for the government in the name of the law, but then in the dark, It should not be public. It should not be officially known to people. Why? Because there is always a certain level of going beyond the normal law. When you are a secret agent, sometimes you have to kill people, right? Okay. And then that, in a normal situation, you are punished for that. But then in a specific condition in which, this is secret agent works, it is allowed. And then so, another James Bond film is called License to Kill. You know what I mean? They are given the license to kill beyond the law in a way of creating a certain state of exception to the law, right? And this is a specificity of this kind of secret agent who is a sovereign figure. Well, this is a biopolitical term, but then you can understand it in a commonsensical notion. It's the sovereign in the sense of, having a certain kind of decision-making power that can even go beyond the normal law, and so on and so forth. But then what is interesting in Skyfall, to cut a long story short, is that in that film, James Bond himself is abjected from his own agency, MI6. You may know that, okay? So in the beginning of the film, he does a certain mission and he fails it, right? And then he is in some sense excluded from the agency. The agency considers him dead. So from the beginning, he becomes a kind of symbolically dead agent. So the rest of the narrative shows how this abject figure struggles to recover his own previous sovereign identity. Okay, and then through a certain mission to fulfill, he in some sense recovers it, reclaims his own identity, which is a sovereign endorsed by the law, and so on and so forth. And towards the end, you still have kind of a conventional happy ending of this franchise, but then this kind of narrative is slightly different from the previous films in the same series. Does it make sense? Which means that even such a secret agent, given the license to kill, can be abjected from this sovereign system, the national law or whatever, suddenly when it turns out to be useless or even harmful for the system itself. So anybody can be an abject. And then in that regard, you can even apply this concept of, the precarious identity to become a kind of abject to everybody in this global situation, right? Who knows, you might lose your job and then you become a homeless people, you become a refugee or something like that. Okay? So in that regard, I want to, in some sense, reconsider this notion of abjection in a larger context of globalization.
Yeah, it's in the cover of this flashy kind of fun action film. There is a deeper thing that connects with us on a human level. Many people have felt that in some way of being cast out or cast off, and what that feeling is relatable. That's how the art itself communicates to us
Exactly.
watching it.
Yeah,
but sometimes we're not aware that's happening. What are some other examples? I know... I think I saw that you mentioned Snowpiercer is another example of a biopolitical film. Can you talk a little bit about I'm trying to uncover some of these themes are things that we have seen in films, but maybe don't always recognize what's happening. I'm a big fan of the dystopian film genre. So, end of the world type thing, but what's happening there for us? Philosophically, why do those resonate with us so deeply?
Exactly. Well, when it comes to dystopian film, it means that it pictures or prefigures a certain dystopian vision of the future, right? But then in any sci-fi film, why do we imagine a certain future that is not here? Because that is related to the present in some sense, right? So in that regard, we can go into details of that film, Snowpiercer. Well, of course, it is all about abjection. The tail and the passengers who are abjected from the whole system, which is called the Snowpiercer, the train, right? Are still there. They are not completely abandoned. They are part of the system, but not recognized as normal citizens, for example. So in some sense, it's like the second-rate citizens or the refugees within the system, or the total abject, which is still in some sense used by the system whenever there's a need. For example, especially these people are not actually the traditional notion of the working class. because, they don't work basically. And then they are not paid for their work. We don't see them working, right? Even though it looks like a kind of, a little socialist and communist and revolutionary film, actually the notion, the structure of this train and its social kind of context shows that this society and these a certain part of its abject people, in the case of emergency, for example, the engine car has a certain secret, basement, compartment in which small children have to walk there in order to fix anything wrong in terms of operating the engine and so on and so forth. Okay, so those keys are needed from that abject group. The main characters of the film, right? So in some sense, they just supply their bodies. They are useful for the whole system only as being bodies themselves, okay? So in that sense, it is biopolitical. Biopolitics means that the politics on the level of your body itself being part of the control system. Okay? It's not about voting for democracy, presidents, congressmen, or whatever. That's much more institutionalized and representative model of politics. But then the bottom of any political system is biopolitics. Why? Because power ultimately and originally means it exercises itself onto your body. Okay? It can take off your life. It can just promote you to a better citizen or whatever. And that is the fundamental basic notion of power. And then biopower means exactly this way of power exerting itself to people's bodies. So this film is in this regard is very biopolitical, and the biopolitically abject people are the main characters. But then, of course, there's a kind of revolutionary movement, led by a heroic figure there. But then another interesting thing is that this is not a conventional disaster film. In Hollywood, for example, usually when it comes to a disaster, it is always overcome. Towards the end, you still have a kind of the restoration of the lost identity or reality or your family or whatever, right? So there's a kind of still happy ending cycle comes back. But in this film, even that revolutionary movement toward and against the power system itself fails. And then the leader of the group, the tail enders, as you may remember, at some point when he encounters the power figure, the leader of the system, I think his name is Wilford, right? He's even convinced to take over that figure's power, right? Well, actually, the Wilford was waiting for somebody to come so that since he's aging, it's time to give his power to somebody else who can control the whole system on behalf of himself, right? So this kind of continuation of biopower is in some sense presumed to sustain itself, right? But at a certain point, the main hero happens to look at the inside of the engine car, those children completely exploited to, work for the engine in a horrible, inhumane condition, right? And then he recognized that, okay, this system, if it always costs certain abject people as like a sacrifice, it may not deserve, sustainability, okay? So he decides to destroy everything, right? But there might be still a kind of a hope, where after destruction of this system, there might be another utopia outside. But then in the end, what we see is just like the total destruction of the whole system. And then only 3 survivors, one small Korean girl, and then a black kid, and then a polar bear there. It's a very ambiguous ending. Maybe an open ending. So in that regard, I don't think this is a conventional disaster movie. So that's why, one of my key terms in my global cinema studies is the cinema of catastrophe. The catastrophe in the sense of going beyond the normal scale of a disaster, right? Because this kind of catastrophe movie does not really give you any hope. You may imagine that, okay, there might be a new relationship between the polar bear and then 2 small kids, but in reality, it's very dismal, right? The polar bear might devour them. Who knows?
Yeah.
So in that sense, this kind of film, in some sense, inspires us to think further about the future of humanity, which may be very, very dystopian insofar as we continue our current civilization based on this type of biopower and exploitation of labor and so on.
Yeah. Wow. A lot to think about there. You also study what you call like emergent genres, and some of those, I didn't mention this in your intro, were mind game films, and like you mentioned, the cinema of catastrophe, interface culture, and posthumanism and popular culture. What is emergent about these genres, and why are they emerging now? Are they like a reflection of what is happening in our global society? Is it a response to something? Why do new film genres emerge when they emerge?
Yeah, exactly. As I just briefly mentioned, in terms of Snowpiercer, this is a film about globalization and its, positive and negative aspects at once. Okay. Positively, well, it can connect all people. It can, bring the humanity to a next step, with more, developed technology or networking system or whatever, new energy source. At the same time, it may depend on the more horrible sovereign power system that always exploits some people who could not be regarded as part of the system, and then almost like diminished to certain abject figures, right? And then this is what is going on in our current society in the name of globalization. So globalization is never always positive, of course, right? So we have to deal with both sides. And then exactly all these, terms and the new trends that I wanted to explore, you mentioned, more or less reflect both sides of globalization. Very briefly, for example, the mind game film is not directly related to globalization, but partly. And I wanted to develop more globalized aspects of the mind game film. Basically, this concept refers to a film that plays games with the characters and spectators at once through very complex puzzle narratives, such as Memento, Minority Report, or Mulholland Drive, or Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind that you may have seen, right? Okay, these are quite different from each other. Some are very romantic, some are action thrillers, and so on and so forth. But then what is common across these films is that the characters sometimes don't know who they are, or they are suffering from a certain traumatic experience, so that they lost their identity or memory or whatever. So what we have to see is to just follow their struggle to regain their identity or subjectivity or whatever. And most of them are abject figure, basically, as I mentioned. We may now get the sense of the concept, right? So in that sense, I mean, this is interesting. Why? Because this trend started around the new millennium. And the Memento was made in 1999, actually, and exactly 2000. And then there are different levels of approaching this type of cinema. For example, within the film studies, aesthetically, this is called a post-classical cinema. So the classical Hollywood system, for example, based on a certain central character who is always pursuing a certain goal to achieve, and so on and so forth, and then ends up with a final, good, happy ending, does not work anymore, or is not fresh anymore. So a lot of filmmakers wanted to, in some sense, experiment on alternatives to this type of classical model and narrativization, right? So Memento is completely different from that kind of thing. And then some other films too. So there are a lot of big twists toward the end of the film, causing kind of cognitive dissonances and ontological shifts between reality and fantasy, dream and, memory, and so on and so forth. So you are sometimes quite disoriented. But then through this kind of experience and viewership, what you get is that probably the current society and our identity itself is no longer stable as before, when the classical Hollywood cinema always wanted to depict, in the form of a very centralized, well coherent heroic figure. the kind of a subjectivity itself is in some sense gives way to a new type of subjectivity in which identity itself is always unstable. It may be very precarious. It can be an abject at a certain moment, as we discussed, right? And that kind of instability or flexibility, or on the other hand, is the core of today's subjectivity in relation to today's very fast-changing environment, social environment, equipped with new technology and globalization, with all its side effects, right? As I said, okay. So that's why this type of film. Well, of course, there's a cinema of catastrophe, and then you mentioned what is the interface culture. Well, actually, this is a little bit different. But then, very briefly, this is a very aesthetic term, and which was actually the concept, the topic of my first book. But then, for example, a lot of mind game films are also time travel films, and I'm actually giving a talk actually in my department next week about this one. Yes, interestingly, all time travel films more or less are about catastrophe, right? From the 1980s classics such as Terminator and the Back to the Future to today's time travel films like Tenet, which was released just last year. What they depict a certain situation in which a catastrophe already happens, but then they want to go back to a certain point in time so that they can, in some sense, prevent the very catastrophe from actually happening, right? So that's why time travel is needed. But then historically, this time travel is more and more developed in Hollywood cinema, especially in the post 9/11 situation. Okay, so the 9/11 was such a decisive moment in Hollywood, so that after that, every film can be allegorical of 9/11. There was a kind of a traumatic event, whether terroristic or not, and then people want to, rewind the time so that they can prevent it. Okay, so this motivation underlies time travel film, which is also the cinema of catastrophe, which is also to some extent the mind game film, because people are disoriented between past and present, and then dream and the future or whatever. Okay, so throughout all this type of adventure. And especially, I just forgot to say about interface. Especially in order to activate this time travel, sometimes you need a certain technology that interfaces with the past. Okay, so if you look at, for example, Deja Vu or Source Code or such films, there is a new technological development of reassigning time, or shifting you back in time, right? Through a certain interface. Okay, so you are always within a certain interface system in which you intervene with the past, trying to solve the problem there, but then shifting back to the present. And in some sense, you are stuck between present and the past in this regard until you completely solve the problem. So all these are intermingling with each other in a way of provoking new thought experiments about our conditions of life, technologically, socio-politically, and aesthetically defined in the new ways.
Yeah, wow. It really shows that, like, how, we often say in the theater, which is my background, like the theater often holds up a mirror to the audience, holds up a mirror to society, and film does the same thing. It's taking influence from and then giving back to what it is seeing in our global culture through globalization and through mass world events almost. It's interesting also, while you were talking about these different elements, in Snowpiercer, the almost hopelessness at the end, and the uncovering of the child being the worker in the engine, and the biopolitical. What kept coming to my mind was Les Miserables. How so many of those themes which was a novel first, French literature, and then later the very famous musical, but many of those themes come through still, almost the exploitation of the working class, the exploitation of children, the branding on his body to be just a number, and how those influences are still coming through into today's world, into a sense of disorientation. Where do we belong? We've been cast off from society. it's very interesting how those things still relate in some way.
That's definitely a good way of thinking about it. I mean, it's a good reference, The Les Miserables like, itself literally means, the very abject people, abandoned by the society, but then not completely demolished. They are still living beings, right? Okay. Mm-hmm. They need to belong to a certain community or network or whatever, but then they don't have an actual legally protected places, right? Mm-hmm. So they demand their places to the society. Of course, what I wanted to emphasize is the update of this miserability, for example. So back in the 19th century in France, there was still like a class sense of class, right? Okay, Les Miserables as a kind of proletarian people who still need to be part of the system, and they demand their right and wages and whatever. These days, for example, in Snowpiercer, as I say, they are not really like a working class people. And then there is no real hope or sense of solidarity either, Actually, one of the good father figures in that film, I think played by William Hurt, is like a wise guy, gives good advice to the heroic figure, the main character. He is actually part of the, system, right? It turns out that, he was in some sense another aspect of Wilford himself. Okay. Mm-hmm. So it's like a Wilford bad cop, and then William good cop or something like that, which means, the system is much more, how can I say, cunning than before. Mm-hmm. And it always co-opting certain people from those miserable people so that they can control and divide them in the way that even the sense of revolution or radical change of the society seems quite, how can I say, invisible. And then this is very, very bad situation. And then that's why, I mean, in some sense, all these films are more important. Why? Because all these films, even if kind of evoking this socio-political condition, do not really give us a real solution. They don't say there's a good alternative outside. No. Well, but then we cannot even demand those filmmakers and cinema to give us an alternative social model that we in reality do not offer, right? So in some sense, the whole world now is stuck between the past revolutionary political model and then the yet to come futuristic model, which is maybe is not completely promised. Mm-hmm. So yeah, global cinema in that regard is in some sense in a deadlock. Right. But at the same time, I think it's still important to look at them. Why? Because by doing so, we could, in some sense, better recognize our situation, and our being stuck in this stalemate itself may provoke certain new thinking and imagination or whatever, if not realistically completely feasible. So in that regard, yes, I see these films.
That's a lot to think about there. And we've been talking a lot about how global cinema is a reflection of globalization and our global culture and mass world events. But apart from the films that are being made, how is the film industry itself shifting with globalization? Just last year in 2020, Parasite won the Oscar. It was a well-deserved, wonderful film. I loved it. But that's changing the way we're looking at cinema that's made globally. Instead of thinking, the Academy has often been focused very much on US-made films, and that's shifting. They've changed some of the criteria. So what is shifting in the industry itself, do you think, as our world increasingly becomes globalized? And in some regards, access to making films is greater. We can shoot 4K on our cell phones, for goodness sake. So how are things shifting in that regard with the industry itself?
Yeah, exactly. I think this aspect in the film industry is also all related to what we have discussed so far in terms of globalization within the cinema content, right? Okay. Parasite is a very good example. It is totally local, right? There's no international actor or whatever. It's like a real Korean film. But what we see is the very polarized class distinction that is very universal in this global society, right? And then, but then again, this is not a kind of revolutionary political film. As I said, okay, what is going on there is actually the miserable in this film do not really challenge the system directly, but then they want to be part of it, okay? They want to get a job there. They want to also enjoy some luxury in their life and so on and so forth, while slightly, distinguish them from other people in the same, for example, class, right? So in this regard, this is more realistically, sensitive to what's going on in our current capitalist society too, right? And then another thing is that, as I said, globalization has two sides. On one hand, it wants to be inclusive, multicultural, very democratic and liberal, based on social networking technology, capitalism and so on and so forth. On the other hand, this inclusion is never completed. It always creates its own remnants excluded from the system, and then those excluded could come back in a very horrible way, terroristically, and so on and so forth, as I said. Okay, in this film, towards of course, up to half the middle of the film, as you see, the miserable people want to be part of the system, and then the owner, the rich people say, "I'm okay with you. I like you. Just do not cross the line." Okay, that is the message. And then this is actually our multicultural message toward those people, refugees and so on and so forth. Okay, I want to tolerate you. I want to accept you. I want to embrace you. But at a certain point, we have a certain invisible boundary we want to keep. Okay, do not really cross the line. I don't really want to be bothered too much by you. Okay, it's okay for you to be a certain part of my land or my nation, but not really in my neighborhood. That kind of sensitivity is, in some sense, already indicative of the double side of globalization as multicultural, right? And then in that regard, since this line itself is maintained, at a certain point, it can be also subverted and destroyed through a terroristic attack, which exactly occurs toward the end of this film, right? So on one hand, multiculturalism, on the other hand, terrorism, the two sides of the same coin called globalization are very locally transformed into this drama called Parasite. Okay, and I think that in that sense, this is really global. What I mean is that now global cinema can be very, very local, while at the same time reflecting the very universal aspect of globalization too. And as you mentioned, it's easier to make a film, right? Even with your cell phone, you can make a good film if you want, and so on and so forth. Which means that I guess this will be a trend. It is not like abnormal that Parasite got just the best picture award last year. Well, this year, just last week, Nomadland, won the best picture and the best director at the Oscar ceremonies, right? It was directed by Chloe Zhao. Still a Chinese. I don't think even she is a Chinese American. She's still Chinese director, but who works with a completely globalized networked people, right? But in a very local way too. Okay, and if you look at, have you seen Nomadland?
It is on my watch list. No, I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, go to that after this meeting.
Yeah.
It is, you cannot imagine how such a film could have been imagined in the past. It was impossible. Nowadays, it seems very natural. Well, who cares, the identity of the director in this case? Which the film is about homeless people, completely American, and then mostly just white homeless people, okay? Somewhere in Nevada. And then the main character just travels around the whole West, I think... she doesn't come to California, but anyway, somewhere here, around here. And then they meet other homeless people and so on and so forth. She meets, that's the story, right? You know what I mean? Of course, again, this is not a politically revolutionary film. It does not mean that, those homeless people want to get together to create a solidarity movement, against the system. No, they just lose their jobs, but then they want to create their own, another lifestyle. Based on certain precarious solidarity. But of course, that does not give them any type of utopian dream, whatever. It's not the romantic, nomadic film at all. Okay, but then this sheer aspect of realistic view of a certain abject group of people that were cast out of the system. The system is very tempting and then compelling, and especially for such young and talented filmmakers like Chloe Zhao or Bong Joon-ho. It's not that different, right? And then I think that this trend will be going on. Well, last year everybody said that Parasite might be just an exception, right? But then just successively, the Best Picture award was given to a minority director in some sense. And then this year, another important film was Minari. It's about Asian Korean American family.
I did see that one. I saw that one. It's very good.
It was quite moving, right?
Yeah.
At the same time, I think it's also important to compare the two Nomadland. On the one hand, Minari is all about how to have a home in this state, in this country, right? On the other hand, Nomadland means that hope for having home itself is illusory to some extent, right? So, of course, Minari is about the past of, the Korean American group community, but it's still going on. Who knows who wouldn't want to have a home? At the same time, the sense of having a home as like an American dream itself can be put into question, right, in a different way, which was very well addressed by Nomadland. Then again, these are the minority films, right, in the conventional sense of the Oscar award, whatever. But then nowadays, they are just coming into the center of the stage, and I think that this trend will go on. And then there's also kind of the institutional, how can I say, increased sensibility to diversity and inclusion, right? And then nowadays, this is a kind of standard. We have a lot of diversity programs and so on and so forth, and then so the whole society, especially in the US now, after the last year's turmoil, socio-political and so on and so forth, I think it now really moves toward the next step in terms of inclusion, so that there will be more minor or middle budget films, but then a little more attentive to these side effects of globalization or whatever. And then I think that we will see such films in the mainstream theaters more and more.
Yeah, I think so too. I'm glad to hear you say that. It gives a lot to think about, and I'm excited for what films we'll see coming out. This year was difficult because of the pandemic. A lot of films that were supposed to come out didn't, and delayed a lot of projects, but I'm excited to see what comes out of the pandemic as people return to making movies and art of all forms. I would love to keep talking. I find this topic and the conversation fascinating, but I want to be respectful of your time. And so we'll move into my just final two questions. I've been doing this at the end of my conversations with our podcast guests. Just some fun way to end things, rapid questions. Do you have a favorite film of all time? If so, what is it?
So whenever I ask this stupid question, I know standard answer.
I know.
Well, one great thing about the film viewing and film scholarship is that, you don't need to trust your taste, because there are so many good films, and then my taste always changes, and this is a good thing. You can always enjoy any film if you are open-minded and serious enough, okay? But still, yes, why not,
Yeah, just for fun.
There are two answers. A conventional answer, a little more experimental answer. And the conventional answer is Blade Runner, actually. And the original Blade Runner made in 1982 by Ridley Scott. And then it's like a cult sci-fi, right, which is so inspiring and still important, I think. But I saw that, as I said, when I was just like a teenage boy in the dark living room in my house when I turned on my TV, just randomly. And of course, I didn't know anything about the film, but I was just captivated by some images there. And then that lingered in my mind for long, to the extent that paradoxically, in a few years later, when I saw it for the second time, with full knowledge about the film, I lost all my nostalgia from that film. And that was a very paradoxically interesting experience, which means that, the first kind of encounter with that film in a very, in some sense, mystified way was like an illusion for me. Okay, that only lingered in my mind like a ghost that would not be materialized. But anyway, that influenced my mind a lot, and it has a lot of things to talk about intellectually. But then, yes, in terms of my film love, yes, that kind of triggered. And then another thing that I want to briefly mention is actually Pierrot Le Fou is a French film made by Jean-Luc Godard, the director of Breathless that I mentioned. And then, Breathless is like a landmark French New Wave film, but then I prefer his other films actually, including this one, Pierrot Le Fou. It is also about a couple who are escaping from the society. So it's like an update of Breathless to some extent. But then it was so kind of loaded with many interesting and intellectual cultural references to develop. And then actually I think my kind of academic interest in film started with my experience of presenting this film at a student conference about the French New Wave film when I was in the college in Korea actually. I didn't know much about that, but then anyway, I chose this film and I explored it day and night really. And that was at the moment very difficult. I mean, it's hard to understand. And then the source of the film that I got was very poor in quality or whatever. So I don't think I completely grasped everything there. But then since I invested and wasted so much time and energy in that film, that still, remains in my mind.
Yeah, some films just stay with you.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Very cool. Well, thank you for sharing those. We'll link them in the show notes as well. I love Blade Runner too, but I'll have to check out the French New Wave film as well. And then final question, what are you looking forward to as we return to more in-person events, or in our specific case, returning to classes and seeing students and professors, or in anything? What are you looking forward to in general as our world begins to open up as we get closer to the end of the pandemic?
Yes, definitely. As other people may say, I really look forward to meeting all those people I have seen online in person to check if they are not just digital ghosts, but real human beings with flesh and bones. So, yeah, this is very actual and real thing. And I think that, of course, there may be a lot of events and experiences we can enjoy. But then I think that the most important aspects of in-person experiences after those events, For example, in the Zoom land, there are a lot of conferences I attend, and even today, there was a talk, by somebody, and I wanted to be there, and so on and so forth. But then, this is very much focusing on the content itself. And after the end of discussion or talk or whatever, everybody disappears, right? There's no like a post-event social, connection and networking involving some alcohol or whatever, which is sometimes more important than the actual event itself. Okay.
Yeah, so getting to discuss what you heard.
Yeah. And I also want to explore, this region because it's relatively still new to me. And then there are a lot of other universities in the LA area and in Southern California, and then the nation in large, right, in general. So maybe I could visit, to some places and then invite some people from there so that we can have a more energetic conversations.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, welcome to Southern California. Definitely a lot to explore here. Yeah. I've only been here for 5 years and I still feel like I have a lot to explore. Yeah. Well, my dad was military, so kind of all over the place, but my dad is from the Pacific Northwest and my mom is from England. So I kind of am like a nomad in my own right.
Okay.
All over.
Nomadic Zoom land for you.
Yes. Well, Professor Jeong, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate your insight and your scholarship, and getting to have this conversation with you was very interesting. And I'm excited to dive more into thinking a little more critically about the popular films I view and how they may be a reflection of our world.
Definitely. It was my pleasure. And really, I enjoyed this talk too. And yes, let's meet in person in the fall, after you watch all those films that I mentioned. Okay?
I will. I think I will. Well, thank you so much and have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Beyond the Stage is produced by the Carpenter Performing Arts Center at Cal State Long Beach. Views expressed by guests of the show or the host are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of the university. A special thanks to today's guests and to the entire staff of the Carpenter Performing Arts Center, including our executive director, Megan Klein-Crockett. Audio engineering is provided by Ken Beaupre, graphic design by Patty Laurel, digital communications by Franz Newman, and additional marketing and media assistance by Amber Legaspi Valdez. Our theme music is by Ken Beaupre. If you'd like to support Beyond the Stage or the Carpenter Performing Arts Center, please visit us online at carpenterarts.org. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.